Serial killers often claim they've found the perfect crime. But here's a twisted tale from 1940s England that shows how even sulfuric acid can't dissolve every trace of murder.
Well, that's certainly a chilling way to start this conversation. You're talking about John George Haigh, aren't you? The acid bath murderer?
Exactly right. And what makes this case so fascinating is how it challenged the legal precedent of no body, no crime, a concept that dated back centuries in British law.
You know what's interesting about that time period? The forensic capabilities were so limited compared to today. I mean, this was before DNA testing, before modern trace evidence analysis.
That's precisely what Hay was counting on. But let's back up a bit to understand how someone becomes an acid bath murderer. His story starts in 1909 in a deeply religious household that belonged to this ultra-strict sect called the Plymouth Brethren.
Oh, yes, I've read about them. We're talking about a group that basically saw sin in everything. No music, no entertainment, constant prayer, and fear of damnation. Must have been quite the childhood.
Well, here's what's particularly fascinating. Psychological studies of Hay later suggested that this oppressive religious environment might have created this weird disconnect between actions and consequences. Like, if you're taught everything is a sin, maybe nothing feels particularly wrong anymore.
That's such an interesting psychological perspective. So, how did he go from that restrictive childhood to becoming a murderer?
Well, it wasn't an immediate jump to murder. He started with what you might call a gateway crime: forgery. He was actually quite skilled at it, forging documents and running various scams. Spent several stints in prison for fraud.
And that's where he came up with his brilliant plan, right? Reading about this French killer who used acid to dispose of bodies?
Exactly right. But here's what makes this case so fascinating. He actually conducted experiments first. He wasn't just some impulsive killer. He was methodical, calculating. He tested different concentrations of acid on mice to perfect his method.
Well, that's absolutely terrifying. The level of planning that went into this?
And you know what's even more disturbing? He kept detailed records of his experiments. The police later found notebooks where he'd written down exactly how long it took different materials to dissolve.
So, tell me about his first victim. How did he actually put this horrific plan into action?
William McSwan, 1944. Here's where it gets really dark. McSwan was actually someone who trusted him, an old acquaintance. Hay lured him to this workshop he'd set up specifically for murder.
Well, that must have required some serious preparation. I mean, where do you even get industrial quantities of sulfuric acid in 1944?
That's one of the most incredible parts. He actually had a legitimate business front that allowed him to purchase chemicals without raising suspicion. Remember, this was during World War II, when lots of industries were using various chemicals for the war effort.
So he basically hid his murders behind the chaos of wartime Britain? That's actually quite clever, in a horrifying way.
And here's where his background in fraud really came into play. After dissolving McSwan, he forged documents to take control of his victims' assets, even maintained correspondence pretending to be McSwan, telling people he'd moved to America.
You know what fascinates me about these kinds of killers? The way they can compartmentalize. Like, how do you go from dissolving someone in acid to calmly writing letters pretending to be them?
Well, that's where his pattern really emerged. After McSwan, he moved on to Dr. Archibald Henderson and his wife Rose. Same method, same careful planning, same asset theft afterward.
And nobody noticed these people were missing? I mean, we're talking about multiple victims here.
That's another fascinating aspect of post-war Britain. People went missing all the time. Bombs, evacuation, immigration. It wasn't unusual for someone to suddenly disappear.
So, how many people did he actually kill before getting caught?
The confirmed number is 6, but here's what's interesting. During his confession, he claimed to have killed 9 people total, though some investigators believe he might have been exaggerating to enhance his notoriety.
Well, that brings up an interesting point about serial killers and their tendency to embellish their crimes. Do we think he was being truthful?
The evidence suggests he was actually being quite honest about most things, except for that bizarre claim about drinking his victim's blood, which experts believe was just an attempt at an insanity defense.
Speaking of evidence, let's talk about how he finally got caught, because this is where the story gets really interesting.
Ah, yes, the infamous gallstone. His final victim was Olive Duran Deacon, a wealthy widow. When she disappeared, people actually noticed and started asking questions.
And that's when his perfect crime started to unravel, right?
Exactly. The police found his workshop, and despite his best efforts with the acid, they discovered these tiny pieces of evidence, including a gallstone and some partial dentures that hadn't fully dissolved.
You know what's fascinating about that? Even today, with all our modern forensic techniques, dental records are still one of the most reliable ways to identify remains.
And here's where the case gets really significant for legal history. It helped establish the precedent that you could secure a murder conviction without a body, using circumstantial evidence.
So, in trying to exploit what he thought was a loophole in the law, he actually helped close it. That's quite ironic.
And speaking of irony, let's talk about his behavior during the trial. This man who was so concerned about his appearance actually asked the prison guards for fashion advice before his execution.
Well, that certainly speaks to his level of detachment from reality. Did he ever show any remorse?
Not really. In fact, contemporary accounts describe him as being almost bored during his trial. He treated the whole thing like some kind of minor inconvenience.
That kind of emotional disconnect really seems to connect back to his upbringing, doesn't it? That early training in separating actions from emotions.
Absolutely fascinating point. And it raises some interesting questions about nature versus nurture in criminal psychology. Was it his strict religious upbringing that created this disconnect? Or did he just use it as an excuse?
You know, cases like this really make you think about how society has changed. I mean, could someone get away with something like this today?
Well, modern forensic science would make it much harder. But here's what's interesting. We still see cases where killers try to use chemicals to dispose of evidence. It's like they haven't learned from Hay's mistakes.
So, what you're saying is, even with all our technological advances, human nature hasn't really changed that much?
That's exactly right. The methods might evolve, but the basic psychology, the belief that you can commit the perfect crime, that seems to be a constant throughout history.
Well, I suppose that's what makes these historical cases so relevant today. They're not just about the past, they're about human nature itself.
And they remind us that sometimes the most dangerous people aren't the ones who look obviously threatening. They're the ones who can maintain a perfectly normal facade while doing absolutely horrific things.
Like a respectable businessman with a barrel of acid in his basement.
Precisely. And perhaps that's the most important lesson from this case, that evil often wears a very ordinary face.